Okay, well, we can kick off. Best wishes to everyone who's still braving the storm, if some of you are out there. Welcome, folks. We're at lecture 8. And today we're going to be talking about noise. I think I've got 3 versions of the title for this, like noisy brain, noise in the brain, neural noise in the brain. They're all variants of the same thing. So the aim for today is actually, I think a lot of the things we'll talk about should be familiar at this point if you have indeed been paying attention over the last few weeks, because noise has come up already, right? So there's a certain amount. It's like intentional. You shouldn't be surprised by a certain amount of familiarity in some of the things that we'll be discussing, because they've been either kind of an inherent part of some of the things we've discussed previously with like the probabilistic brain stuff last time, and properties of oscillatory systems with a little bit of noise in there, all that stuff. You know, we weren't focusing on the noise, or the randomness, the few kind of different words we could use here, but it was there. So we're like revisiting some of those, but thinking about specifically the contributions of the noise, randomness, variability per se. So that's the plan for today. So we're almost at the end of our wonderful journey. As I said before, you know, for the last few lectures now, I think, is that we took our journey up the spatial scales in the first 5 lectures or so, yeah. And then we're at the point of talking about things that now span everything, right? So that was the case when we were thinking about kind of information coding and representational stuff in the probabilistic brain lecture last time, and oscillations. You know, those are things that happen at multiple spatial scales. They have different properties, but they're things that we can kind of do neuroscience on as neuroscientists who study cells, neuroscientists who study, you know, networks in a dish, neuroscientists who study people in a brain scanner, and so on. Same applies for last time, and same applies for today. So we have noise kind of all over the place. It's not the same, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's all these things that apply across all these scales are kind of, you should think about them in exactly the same terms, but in kind of broad strokes, these are phenomena that exist at all of the scales that we can and do neuroscience at. So there's some references here if you want to do some kind of further reading on this. I recommend in particular this article by André Longtin, who was Jeremie's thesis advisor, and he has this article on Scholarpedia, which is a kind of Wikipedia for academics, if you like, but it's free. So there's a good article on noise there, and some other things that we'll be going through, and more stuff that's not included here we'll be covering today. Okay, so let's kind of get to the heart of where we need to start when we're talking about noise in the brain, which is, what do we mean by noise? And the answer to that, of course, is it depends, right? Or there's like a frustrating, you know, set of answers we could give that kind of depends on what it is that we're talking about. But the reason why there's a set of answers is because there are a number of different phenomena that get one way or another kind of listed under the umbrella terms like neural noise, that are, you know, should actually be thought about as differently in some contexts, and have different valence, if you like. So the natural one is like, is noise good or is noise bad, right? So I think the actual word noise as such kind of tends to come with a little bit of, you know, negative valence, right? Like it's disruptive, it's adding, degrading. it's adding uninteresting signal, right? So that's one of the concepts of noise that is in the umbrella when we're talking about noise in the brain, but it's well, at least I'd say it's one of several. I might also go as far as to say it's one of the less interesting ones. Okay, so but in any case, like things that we might be thinking about when we're talking about noise. One is kind of vanilla concept of noise, right? Noise, bad noise being, let's say, and then we could experimentally or kind of technologically or otherwise like confounding signal contributions in things that we're measuring that we don't like, right? We don't want them to be there, but they're there. They're kind of unavoidable. Maybe we need to model them and currently like include them in our analysis or our theory, but they're not part of the system we're interested in a meaningful way. Okay. So more on that as we go. Now there are other kind of notions of noise or things that we want to include in this umbrella, and what is often kind of preferred, and that you'll see a lot of commentary if you kind of do some Googling and deep dive on this general topic, you'll see a certain amount of commentary kind of saying, well, it's better to actually go with this term variability. Okay, so this would be your kind of like positive valence or at least neutral valence kind of equivalent to noise. And it's a bit more neutral in the sense that here maybe we're still talking about variation and like the amount of variation in signals could be variation that's coming from negative things like instrument noise, could be positive things like intrinsically useful signal variations, but at least it's kind of neutral linguistically. So you'll see this phrase variability. Okay, so if we go with that a little bit, so there's noise in terms of contamination. If we think about variability per se, right? So variability would be and so there are a few places we can go kind of unpacking this as kind of a concept, right? So one would be variability over time. So I have some neuron or some measurement that I'm making, and I measure it now, I measure it in 2 seconds, I measure it in 10 minutes, I measure whatever the time frame is, but there's fluctuations, right? So just that in and of itself, right? Like a concept of fluctuation is like a minimal definition of variability, and that actually has a lot of legs. Like has been and continues to be quite a useful thing to study in neural systems, again at multiple scales. Is like how much variability is there in your signal. Just take, for example, like the variance of a time series. Often the variance of time series, for example, you measure from human EEG, has a good amount of predictive value on things like pathologies and potentially in a counterintuitive direction. Like more variance is often good or better with respect to, say, symptom intensities in certain diseases. So I'm just kind of jamming on this general title question here, like what is neural noise? Okay, so variability, I just talked about variability kind of just as a time series property or like kind of variance, if you like, statistical property of time series. Another related kind of variability would say variability upon events. Okay, so like upon presentation of stimuli, right? So trial to trial variability. I think I've got some images on that in a bit, so I won't go too far on this. And so on and so forth. So there's I'm just kind of pointing to the kind of questions here, and I won't continue listing all of the instantiations of the concept of noise, because that's what we're going to do over the next lecture. Okay, so we're going to be continually doing that over like all of the slides coming up. Is like, here is one type of system variability or kind of temporal variance feature that we'll call noise, and could be kind of good, could be bad, could have various kinds of qualitative effects on how things behave. And we'll kind of call them all noise, but we appreciate that noise is not the perfect kind of vocabulary for various reasons, various kind of technical semantic reasons. Okay. You know, another one, maybe just to continue with the bullet points here, because I don't think I'm going to comment too much about this in the slides, but it's kind of an obvious one in a way. So this is like dimensionality. Okay, so the classic concept of chaos, you know, in nonlinear systems is sensitive dependence on initial conditions for some deterministic low-dimensional dynamical system, nonlinear dynamical system. You know, so you kind of have some simple, even like three-dimensional interactive system of equations, and you kind of initialize at one point, run forward in time, initialize at a slightly different point, run forward in time, you end up in entirely different places. Okay, in a fully deterministic fashion. That's what chaos means in a technical sense from the point of view of nonlinear dynamics. Now, it's noise. It's very noise adjacent, right? Because sensitive dependence on something, right? As in, like, you do something and then you repeat and you get a different result, right? So that, I mean, that was what I just described during the definition of chaos, but you could imagine that being exactly the same thing where you do not have a chaotic system, but you have a system that has some noise, and the noise is the thing that's different on every instantiation. And if you didn't have the noise, then you would get a kind of fully deterministic, like, same result every time. But the fact that there's a little bit of noise could be of various types of noise, let's say, even just noise in the definition of the initial conditions, or variability or imprecision, right? And then these two things kind of end up being somewhat similar. So that's just, say, the precision, right? Then you've got dimensionality, which is another direction in which chaos kind of deviates from, or say, like, another kind of adjacent concept here from the point of view of modeling complex systems, understanding complex systems. Like, is there a kind of truly chaotic feature here, or even, for example, like a truly sensitively noise-driven feature, or is there some hidden dimension that we're not seeing, right? And that's kind of a particularly salient issue in things like neuroscience, neurobiology, where we don't measure everything. We know for sure we're not seeing everything, and we know for sure that this is a big kind of interacting network of multiple components. So the kind of question of whether you have all of the variables defined, and the associated question of whether, when you see something unexpected, is that because there's some, like, intrinsically chaotic property, or is there just some other unobserved factor that kind of comes into that? These are, if you like, kind of an adjacent set of concepts, not just in neuroscience, but I think they're particularly kind of manifest in the properties that we have with neuroscience, like high dimensional, sparsely sampled, very nonlinear, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is our setting. Actually, I'm gonna open up for just any questions first. Oh, great, we already got questions from Ravindu. So I think, yeah, this is probably a good time to take some initial questions. So Shirin says, do we mean randomness by noise? Okay, I'm going to read both of them, then I'll answer them. Okay, so Shirin, do we mean randomness? Ravindu says, Hi, Professor. When you say chaotic systems, I'm guessing it resembles systems like Lorentz equations. If so, are there similar 3D models that have that sort of dynamics from a neuroscience perspective? Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer those two in terms. So Sharon, do we mean randomness by noise? Yes and no. Right? That's kind of what I'm getting at when I'm with the point I was making at the start of this slide, right? It's like we kind of have we have a bit of an umbrella of a few related concepts that for present purposes we can just call them all noise, but they're not all the same kind of noise, right? So I mentioned a few there. I think if there's any if that's not clear, then it'll become more clear as we go. But you're saying, do we mean randomness by noise? Like yes, but what's the type of randomness? I think is the kind of operant question, right? So the source of the variability, right? And is the source of the variability a meaningful source of variability? And how does that variability interact with things? Those are the questions that we're kind of working with here. So yes, randomness is kind of maybe another synonym that we put in here, but it's more a question of like, where is it coming from? What is its flavor? What does it do? Right. So that's what we're going to unpack here. And then to the second question, Ravindu is saying, are we talking about Lorentz systems and are there similar 3D models? So yes, that's what I was referring to as like classic chaotic attractor sensitive dependence. Are there similar 3D models that have that sort of dynamics from neuroscience perspective? Well, yes, many. Do we get chaos in any of the models that we've focused on? Maybe, but I don't think the two-dimensional ones that we've mostly focused on are kind of classically chaotic systems. In fact, I'm not 100% sure they're capable of it, but they're not. But I mean, the answer is yes. Like most of the models we're working with in neuroscience, apart from the very simple ones, will show chaotic behavior in some regimes, and we may or may not be interested in those regimes, right? So often, like the domain of parameter space and state space where you start to see chaotic behavior, particularly kind of very noisy, I shouldn't say noisy, very highly fluctuating chaotic behavior is not where we kind of are interested in. But yes, a lot of the neural systems we work with, they will kind of exhibit chaotic behavior in some domains. And sometimes that's something that people consider to be an important property of them. But coming back to the point I was making earlier, it's sort of a moot point whether it's like genuinely chaotic or not, even if the kind of original the basic equation of your model is got some like well-defined chaotic dynamics, okay? But then that's going to be one node in a network of 500 units. Then it's already like a high-dimensional system at this point. So whether the like three-dimensional single node is kind of has some interesting chaotic properties doesn't really matter if you're going to put it along with another 500 nodes that have a whole load of nonlinear richness, because it's now like just a very multi-dimensional, like high number of variable systems. So the idea of chaos, the interesting thing really is when it's low dimensional, right? And it's like actually a low dimensional set of equations. So when we're kind of going up to the properties of networks, which often we want to do, then it's like, I think it's kind of interesting to say, oh, this is chaotic behavior, because high dimensional systems can do complicated things and that will have these kind of sensitive dependence properties. So, but I think I'm digressing at this point. Thanks for the questions. Was there any other questions in the room on just the setup here? Yeah, everyone happy with how we're going to proceed? Good. Okay, so So I mentioned a few of these things. I'm just going to show some images just to kind of reinforce this. So response variability, neural variability. This is one example. Another example on the next slide. This is a very famous commentary on this general concept from Shadlin and Newsom. The point is basically, I'd call this trial variability or response variability. So 210 presentations of an identical random dot motion stimulus, raster plot of a bunch of neurons, and then just picking a few of them over a small period of time and just plotting them as a little time series here. And sorry, plotting the time series here, this little slice. And basically like it varies a lot, okay? So the point being, like, this is 210 presentations of an identical, these are like, this is the same event. So you can take two perspectives here. One, you could say, well, look, I've done an experiment and I've done 210 trials, and, you know, things will be different every time you do something, but that will be, if you recall back to the first thing I was saying on the previous slide, that'd be like the uninteresting type of noise, which would be something that we haven't accounted for, like the stimulus, the I don't know, light properties of the room were different, or there's some kind of system noise, like measurement noise. Someone closed the door down the corridor. That's literally something that matters with MEG, which is very sensitive, you know, uses like extremely sensitive magnetometers to measure brain activity, which is very low amplitude. So yeah, for example, like the MEG system at Sick Kids over on Bay Street is quite near the subway, right? So you can see the subway in the MEG, you know, I mean, from an experimental point of view, depending on your context, is either just unavoidable or something that you can't fully remove. Okay. But, and this is, I think, the kind of interesting point that is, you know, emphasized here, and it is certainly the case. Like, we can remove all of the experimental variability, all the confounds, right? Possible, depends on the recording modality and so on, but you can, to a reasonable level of certainty, like say, we have eliminated all of the you know, extraneous factors here, and we still get this. So that's kind of the point that's being made here, and actually on my next one, which is a different type of recording. So this is like a slightly larger, like mesoscale thing. It's a calcium imaging measurement from a 2x2 millimeter cortex from a repeated visual stimulus. The point is just to show this row and this row slightly different, you know, colored blobs in this figure here. And so when you have a very, very tightly controlled experimental context, you have a very decent amount of confidence that your measurements, neural recording apparatus is kind of minimally sensitive to any kind of extraneous factors, we still get trial to trial variability, right? So trial to trial variability is, as far as we can tell, an intrinsic part of brain activity to a certain point. So this is like a fact. So this is an interesting fact that like merits thinking about, merits explaining, and that's to some extent one of the things that we're going to be thinking about as we go. So another part of the picture here, and we've touched on this in previous lectures as well, is if you like, characterizing types of noise from a very physiological, biophysical perspective. So there's I think I mentioned this before, a nice review paper, getting a little bit old now, but from Aldo Faisal from a while back, just having a go at breaking this down. So that's what this image is doing, just to give you a few kind of pointers, right? So it's like person seeing things, touching things. Okay, so or moving. But all of these points, if in this kind of input output cycle, right? There's like a little arrow here that's going from like stimulus input, stimulus in, brain processing, motor response. We can have noise in terms of like the sensory transduction. So this is, if you like, the interaction of the light on the receptive cell surfaces and the associated kind of properties of ion channel conduction and like protein folding, protein conformations that happen when parts of our cells respond to various kinds of input from the world. Then we have things going on in neurons, which should be pretty familiar because we've talked about this over several lectures now. Ion channels fluctuating. Talk more about that in the next slide, I think. Electrical noise, so cellular noise. You know, this would be, if you like, kind of molecule noise, right? Or what's the word I'm looking for here? Or kind of like statistical mechanics of wet chemicals in a slush. Just to give us a kind of non-technical description here, right? It's kind of what biology is. It's a bunch of chemicals just sloshing around. So there's just kind of randomness there. And then we have something you might think of as electrical noise from a more kind of engineering perspective, which relates to these kind of current fluxes that we know are important for active and passive properties of membranes. Then we have stuff kind of scaling up, right? Where there's some interaction between what's going on in the extracellular space and what's going on in the intracellular space. Sorry, here, so you say here and here, right? When we're talking about the process of communication between cells, okay? And if we kind of fast forward, so there's been a lot of stuff skipped from here to here, but then we're talking about, say, the motor response, a lot of similar stuff, but even goes outside of the nerve system. If we're talking about measuring things like motor responses, behavioral outputs, then, you know, all of the stuff that we talked about, we're thinking about here, you know, also applies in muscles as well as neurons, because muscles are a lot like neurons, and so on and so forth. So this is one elaborated breakdown of a certain type of family of types of noise that are like parts of biophysics, if you like. So one of those was channel noise, okay, ion channel noise. This is something that we can at least kind of conceptualize on the basis of things that we've talked about so far. So the process of opening and closing of ion channels, okay, and the so the image I'm looking for here. So this is something that has a certain amount of randomness. We talked about this a lot when we were talking about the Hodgkin-Huxley model, okay, where this was, you know, the rate of change, the dynamics of the action potential, the voltage response of a membrane, which is this V dot here, as a function of three primary currents, the potassium, sodium, elite current, and these two have these gated ion channels that have a particular kind type of channel kinetics, right? So like opening and closing rates. So that's what this figure is here. The one on the right, I start there. So this is the neuron bit, or the kind of the bit that's more like what we measure, right? So we've got these will be our three. No, these are the ion channels themselves. These are the gating variables. These are the opening and closing probabilities. So we have these three activation gates, okay, and these are telling us kind of how quickly things are opening and how quickly things are closing. Sorry, what proportion of the the components of the ion channel are opening and closing at what speed, given the number that are currently open and currently closed, so available for transitioning from open to close at every point in time, kind of instantaneously. So that's kind of what these terms in the Hodgkin-Huxley equations are telling us. They're telling us about this kind of fluctuation of the opening and closing probabilities of these subcomponents, these molecular protein subunits of the ion channels of the neuron. Okay, so these are part of Hodgkin-Huxley equation, right? They're there. They're these M, N, and H functions, because these are also differential equations in the Hodgkin-Huxley equation. Now, in terms of this question about opening and closing an ion channels, well, what we haven't, what's not quite part of this picture, or we haven't really embraced, let's say, is the fact that this is stochastic. Okay, so there is a randomness in this phenomena. So that's what this image is showing here. These are just traces of intracellular neuron recordings and patch clamp recordings that have nothing else, nothing going on, but we see these little blips. Okay, so these little blips here, these are stochastic opening of these ion channels that's like not induced by anything other than some type of noise. Okay, now what type of noise? I think that's something that I actually don't have the answer to. I think is either it's like an open question, or that's like something that's a topic for discussion, but it's something like thermal noise, or something that's kind of quite kind of biophysically statistical mechanical property of just kind of fluctuations of proteins slushing around in a dish in a bit of water, as I was saying. It's like biological bits of biology are. So the way that we would deal with that, which we aren't going to do here, but the natural thing to do is just to say, well, we can treat these as like stochastic variables, right? So there's some opening and closing, but it's also some randomness in the opening and closing fluctuation, and so what, like, add some noise on these differential equations, or the variables, these differential equations, and then kind of proceed with that approach to kind of characterizing out from a modeling point of view. Okay, so that will be the point that I want to get to here. And the next slide is like, how would we incorporate noise in our mathematical approach to characterizing neural systems? So I said we could add some noise on these things in Hodgkin-Huxley equations if we so choose. What if we go one step up, one kind of level up to the rate, the domain of neural models and neural dynamics, not at the level of individual spikes or the level of individual cell membrane patches, but rather at the level of like events of firing. Okay, so these were as we covered in the first few lectures, these are what we will call rate models. So rate models of cells, or neural mass models, are always rate models as well, but rate models of averages of cells. So when we're writing down the equations for our rate models of neurons and our rate models of mean field models, often you'll remember we have these noise term at the end. Should probably start with that as an example, but you'll recall we often have some kind of plus noise, right? And the plus noise is often we're saying it's Gaussian noise, saying Gaussian white noise. So saying our model of neuron is some fluctuating currents, or some fluctuating maybe different quantity, like kind of synaptic gating, or a kind of firing rate inputs, or just like an abstract activation quantity. You know, the different definitions of what the variables are, but they'd be like dynamics of that, and then like plus noise, right? Additive noise. So and we usually treat that as a Gaussian distribution. So this point, when we make it on this point on this slide here is just that why is that justified? Why is it justified to treat the noise in the neural systems as a Gaussian distribution, as a normal distribution? And the reason is basically central limit theorem. Okay, so we know if you take neurons and just measure like the time distribution, the kind of firing probability distribution of spikes for any given neuron measurement, which would be, for example, one of these. So these like little blips over time. So what are the rate at which these come? So these are always, it's just a kind of well-established fact, they're like Poisson distributed random variables. Okay, so they're kind of, they look like this. They're kind of skewed and peaked over to peaky and skewed over to the left, right? So neuron firing rate statistics are Poisson distributed. We have talked a little bit about Poisson, like neural Poisson models, Poisson neural models over the previous lectures as well. The reason why we can kind of at least justify to ourselves why it makes sense to use Gaussian noise in kind of slightly in models that are scaled up, like a few levels up from individual neurons, is because if you take a sum of a bunch of Poisson processes, they become Gaussian. This is like a fairly basic or kind of well-known property of like probability theory. So that's basically what we're talking about here. So these are our kind of delta function t negative t. So this is our spike, if you like, this process here, and we have some window, temporal window. So you take the sum of the spikes over some temporal window. That's like the spike rate for that neuron. If we then take, and this is kind of the key bit really that justifies that, if we consider then a network, and it doesn't need to be a particularly well-defined network, but we say like we take the sum of a bunch of these Poisson distributed spiking entities, these Poisson neurons, where there's some variability in the weights, because what we're doing is taking the sum of, and then, sorry, we're taking a bunch of these, try and point at the right thing when I'm saying the words. Each of these things indicated by this sum, this would be like one neuron, okay? Call that like index I. If we take n of these neurons, weight them by some variable weighting, and these are Poisson distributed, then this will converge towards a Gaussian distributed random variable, which is kind of what we're showing here. This is like as a function of the rate constant, so the kind of firing rate frequency. So when the firing rate frequency approaches a certain frequency, things is the use of hertz, the lambda here. So that's a green line here. So when firing frequencies are above a certain amount, then taking a sum of some Poisson distributed neurons will give you a random distribution of firing rates. And then those are, so that gives us a justification, an explanation and justification for having our Gaussian term as the noise term in our models of neural dynamics, okay? Why a noise term? So we kind of covered this before a little bit. So the idea is that this is just like background input, like unstructured background input, stuff that we're not referring to per se in our specific formulation of whatever it is that we're actually specifically trying to model, but we know that the kind of like basic, how to say, like kind of acoustic ambience of neurons in the brain is that they're hearing a lot of stuff, and the statistics of the stuff they're hearing is according to this, going to be white noise, and that's the background. Okay, so so to the extent that like the background is some background noise input, then and it's coming from neurons that are Poisson distributed, then we can think of them as, we can model them in that way. Okay, so that's just some initial remarks on how we think about noise. Got some questions already. Okay, Shivank, I'm going to get back to your question in a little bit when there's a time for a break, but I just want to say I've seen it and it looks like a good question. Okay, so one of the things I was referring to in my opening thing, I think about kind of valence of the idea of noise, right? So this is kind of addressing that point a little bit more concretely. There are benefits of noise or variability, if you like, in a number of different ways. So, I mean, the obvious one, which is some of the ones present in some of these, is that it kind of simplifies our job as theoretical neuroscientists in some ways. So that's like the benefit to the scientist or to the modeler. And then there's maybe the more interesting and more important question is like, what is the benefit to the brain of having some kind of intrinsic noise dynamics? Like, how does it help in information processing, or just how it kind of organizes its dynamics, or at least what does it do? Right. So this is what we're going to cover for most of the rest of the lecture now. Some of the examples of how, again, like you can think of this just like implications or effects of noise, but the general flavor of these is that they're at least kind of they're types of dynamical richness that result from noise. And insofar as that's something that we consider to be a positive thing, which in some cases it is definitely a positive thing in terms of like signal classification and so on, then we can point to noise. We can think of noise as being beneficial in a number of contexts. So stochastic resonance, stabilization of solutions, noise-induced transitions, exploration of dynamic repertoire, and linearization of certain phenomena. Some of these, again, we've touched on in previous lectures, and some of them I don't think we have. So stochastic resonance, this is maybe a kind of general point. We're not going to go too deep into this, but I think it's something that probably is familiar to people who have a little bit of background in complex systems, is this phenomenon. So the idea of stochastic resonance is you have some signal. So this is like a kind of a real signal in the sense of it's a sine wave, right? From an electrical engineering point of view, this will be a signal. So we have some signal, we have some detection threshold. So this is a very, signal detection kind of framing. But we could think about, well, I'll expand on what we might want to make of this in a second. But the phenomenon of stochastic resonance is just noise pushing this signal above a detection threshold. Okay, and it's noise in the sense of like it's not changing anything in terms of the basic dynamics, which is the signal, and it's, if you like, corrupting it a little bit because it's not a perfect rendition of the signal, but it is still basically giving us an oscillation, right? So it's just like adding a little bit of amplitude, and that little bit of amplitude is pushing over detection threshold. So that's kind of all over the place, I would say, in science, in mathematical science. Stochastic resonance as a kind of useful tool, or at least something that we can see, and this will crop up in some of the examples that we'll cover, but I'm not going to go into it in a whole lot of detail any further, apart from this point. So it's not just, so this is like a dynamics example, right? This is an oscillation. I'm not expanding so much on like what is the detection threshold, but one, the detection threshold could be, if you like, neurons receiving inputs, and is the input leading them to respond, right? So for example, like this could be the threshold response of a neuron, right? The threshold potential of an individual neuron. Or if we think about like at a population level, it would be more like, are you in the linear part of the sigmoid rather than the low end saturating part of the sigmoid, right? The kind of responsive part of the response function. So there are a few different contexts where you can think about this threshold appearing in the dynamical models that we've talked about so far. The bottom example here is actually more of a information processing type example. Is just saying this is the performance of I think a neural network. I forget what this specific example is, but the idea is that you've got some image that you're actually adding noise. So the noise is like background speckle. It's like background illumination. It's corrupting the original signal, but it's kind of like shining a light through it. Okay. So in other words, like that's another example of the type of phenomenon that you're going to broadly talk about as stochastic resonance. This is like add a bit of noise that can improve detection on well, like images and image processing tasks to a point. Okay, so that's stochastic resonance. Second example, I think it was the second example had on our list was stabilization. Okay, so this is something that we see in a few contexts, few kind of dynamical contexts, but one that is, I think, interesting if we go back to our neural fields lecture. I think it was lecture 4, and we talked about different types of phenomenons in neural fields. One of the main ones being kind of traveling waves or bumps, right? So a traveling wave would be something like this. So we've got a bunch of neurons on the x-axis, time on the y-axis. So I'm talking about this block on the left-hand side. So we have these kind of diagonal stripes of activation. Doesn't really matter what the activation is, right? Could be firing rate, could be like membrane potential. But the point is like on and off, right? White and black. So we've got over time and over some spatially organized index. That's the important thing about when we're looking at these kind of dynamics in these like two-dimensional time versus like cell index representations. Like the neuron index kind of needs to have some kind of spatial proximity to it. Doesn't need to be literally on a line, but spatial proximity. So then we can talk about what we see here as being a traveling wave, right? Where we've got for one neuron over time, so it would be like one vertical slice, then it kind of like comes on, stays on, roughly goes off, but its neighbor came on earlier, right? And its other neighbor came on later, and that's like a traveling wave over the population. So this is like system under one parameter and system under another parameter. The system is a kind of simple neural field model, one of the kinds that we were looking at earlier. But the difference is the noise amplitude. Okay, so there's a sigma here. So this is like standard deviation of noise and noise term, which is not this equation here. I kind of missed out. The noise part is actually kind of implied here. I should have written it. We should have it written in. But there's like plus noise on this kind of neural activity model, neural membrane potential fluctuation equation here. But the point is the amplitude of the noise. So sigma 0 here, so there was no noise. Sigma 0.3 here, so a little bit of noise. And the difference is this thing here. So, I mean, firstly, it's a bit more rough and messy, right? Which is just what happens when you add in noise. But the key thing of interest here from the point of view of the kind of dynamics that we care about is that we've got a bump, right? So the bump, a bump, if you recall in the kind of neural field lingo, is a kind of ridge. You know, it's like over your population, you've got some that are on and some that are off. So broadly, what we've got here is over time. So time coming in, neurons coming in. We've got a group of cells that are showing a constant response over time. Okay, so the kind of the left and the right sides of this little patch of white of bright within the blue box are like roughly vertical, okay, as opposed to these that are clearly horizontal, clearly diagonal, right? So what's happened here is that the addition of some noise has moved this neural field model from activity regime where it supports this kind of traveling wave structure. In other words, like neurons they'll engage in some dynamics, but they won't stay on, right? They'll be kind of part of a transitory traveling activity pulse. Whereas here, for some period of time, it's like a couple of 100 milliseconds. So it's not kind of stable in terms of fully stable overall time. But for a certain period, they've moved into a kind of constant firing regime where they stay on, right? So we don't have a traveling wave in here. We have a bump. We have a stationary bump. And this is a stationary bump that is kind of exclusively enabled by the addition of a small amount of noise. So this is what we think of as like stabilization of a localized bump solution in a neural field model by addition of a small amount of noise. The image here on the right, just to finish it up, is just talking about the propagation speed. So it's just a way of like quantifying what I was saying there. So there's some this is like high speed, this is like roughly 0 speed. Okay, so this bit over here is inside the box, and then this bit over here. So there's like a number of neurons, or yeah, a number of like parts of this picture that are showing a low or like effectively 0 speed wave propagation, and then the other parts, which is here, this is showing like a high speed wave propagation, which is what we're seeing here. So this is this kind of like bimodal structure of the wave propagation speed, but the point being the low speed is stationary, and this can be achieved just by the stabilizing effect of adding some noise. Okay, so that was our example 2. We're going to continue this and spend a little bit of time thinking about this from the point of view of the Fokker-Planck equation that we jumped in, and I think we jumped in fairly kind of intensely, but also quite quickly a few lectures back. So Fokker-Planck is back, and I should say, by the way, in case it's not obvious or people aren't sure, the course that we're teaching here, this is a kind of collaborative effort between Jeremie, Lefebvre, and Ottawa, and myself. So the commentary here is like Jeremie's commentary. Jeremie has a more refined perspective on stochastic dynamical systems than I do. So he thinks, and I'm not going to disagree, that like this is a weird object. This equation is a weird object because the random fluctuations don't allow the system to fully stabilize. There's no fixed points. Okay, but in any case, so what we've got here is a stochastic differential equation with white noise. And minimal, we've got two terms. We've got a drift term, sorry, diffusion term Q, and a drift term G. And then we've got our noise term psi, and the standard deviation of the noise kind of sitting on the other side of G. But this is coming back to, I think, the discussion we had last time as well. This is multiplicative noise, right? Because the noise term is being multiplied by some function of X, some function of the activity. Okay, so X is featuring here. So we have our drift and diffusion terms, and the general point that we're going to kind of articulate over the next few slides is what is the effect of having some noise in there, what is the effect of the noise term on some of the kind of core properties of the dynamics? So the approach with the kind of Fokker-Planck formalism is to move from this type of equation that, if you like, is like a single instantiation of a particle flow to a different quantity, which we could denoting P, which is now going to be like a probability density function on the particle flow. So like, what is the probability of, in this case, like neural activity being in a certain, at a certain amplitude or in a certain location of its state space, and how does that fluctuate over time? But the thing that's going to fluctuate over time is going to be both the mean and the standard deviation, right? So the kind of structure for Fokker-Planck is like, looks something like this. Broadly speaking, you're going to take the drift part of your dynamical model, your neural model, and shove that in here. And they're going to take your diffusion part of your neural model and shove that in here. And we have like this kind of first order expressions for how this evolves, interacting with the probability density here, and second order stuff, the variance. So when we kind of set this up without going through the derivation, what we can arrive at a stationary solution, so a fixed point for our probability density. It looks like so, this exponential integral equation here. And broadly speaking, like what we're doing here, the way to conceptualize it is we're swapping fixed points for means, right? So where in the, like, usually when we're finding steady state solutions for our differential equations and our neural models, we're saying like, where is the dynamics, unchanging, that's the fixed point, and then what's going on around the fixed point. Same kind of thing in the extension with the Fokker-Planck equations, but then the quantity that we're interested in is not going to be the fixed point, but it's going to be like the mode of the distribution, the mode of the probability distribution. So in the additive, so we're going to consider like two examples here: additive noise and multiplicative noise. The previous one, this was multiplicative noise, if you remember, because we had our our dynamical equation kind of appearing here and here. Now we're going to start with additive noise first. Okay, so this is like mostly, as I said last time, this is, I think most of the time, this is how we're kind of treating noise from the neural modeling point of view. As well, if you're, I mean, the rationale that I gave with the central limit theorem convergence of the Poisson processes, like that applies to this. Doesn't really apply to this, I don't think. In any case, so kind of minimal cubic stochastic differential equation, but like somewhat similar to the first term of Fitzhugh-Nagumo equation, if you want to think about it that way. And sorry, the first variable of a Fitzhugh-Nagumo model. So we kind of swap this into the Fokker-Planck equation and do some substitution that, frankly, I'm not really sure how to arrive at that substitution. But what we can get is a form for the stationary density that has, it kind of changes its shape as a function of the standard deviation of the variance, right? So this D now, okay, so that's this term here. So we can kind of parameterize and vary the amount of noise in the system, and this changes the geometric structure of the probability density that we're kind of getting from this stationary solution. I mean, it changes it in terms of like stretches it into a like deep double well versus a shallower double well. But the key thing to note here with respect to what we'll see on the next slide, and I appreciate this is quite an abstract, not very neural point here, but we're just kind of focusing on the phenomena of the kind of equations at this point. These are kind of stretched versions of basically the same object, particularly like this bimodal distribution, but the modes of the distribution are in the same locations. So the values on the x-axis of the modes of this probability distribution, they're not changing. So in other words, like our fixed points aren't changing, but our likelihood of being like in what the sharpness of the likelihood of us being in one or the other or moving in between, that's what we're modifying when we're modifying the standard deviation parameter in this expression. Okay, so this is with additive noise. Excuse me. So multiplicative noise example now, quadratic, not cubic, but basically the same general structure. And again, the thing that makes it multiplicative is we've got the x appearing over here in the noise term. Okay, so in this case, things get more complicated. Again, we're not doing derivation, but we get a form for the stationary probability density, and then what that looks like as a graph is, here's two examples, and then the thing that we're doing here, the same thing we did in the previous slide, is modify the amplitude of the noise. But what's going on in this case is that it's actually changing in a more substantial way the shape of the distribution. So in two ways. One, and the kind of key one from the point of view of, we think about the peaks in the probability density function for the Fokker-Planck as being the analog of the fixed points, is it's moving, right? So the mean of this is at like 0.5 here. And I should say the mean, the peak, the modal value, the expectation is at 0.5 here. I shouldn't say mean because mean is also like mu is also a parameter here, so should be clear. But like if you say the shape of the probability distribution is like so, and then ramp up the noise. In this case, I just realized, the guys on the call, are you seeing the laser pointer okay? Because I realize sometimes you haven't.
Yes, it's
I'm doing a lot of laser pointer right now. Let me know if you're not seeing the laser pointer and try and fix that. But I'll continue the point for now. So the difference is that the mode of this distribution has moved over to the left. Okay, so increasing the noise has changed the expectation of the probability distribution over the dynamical variable. Okay, and it's changed the shape. So it's basically skewed it over to the right. If we, yeah, it's shifted the mean, and I guess necessarily because it shifted the mean, given that it's a probability distribution, so it's kind of capped at 1 anyway. It's also skewed. So this is something that can only happen in the case of multiplicative noise. This kind of modification of the kind of core dynamics in the system, insofar as these properties like the fixed points and the locations of the modes of the probability distribution are the kind of core dynamical properties of these systems under the Fokker-Planck formalism. Now, I've got a few more slides to kind of give a bit more on why that matters from a dynamical perspective. Okay, because here, I mean, who cares, right? It's just a Gaussian distribution that's just shifted from 0.5 over to 0.2, right? Like it's a bit abstract. So let's just kind of put a bit of meat on that from a neural dynamics, or at least a dynamics point of view. So the type of phenomenon we were looking at just now, that so the effect of multiplicative noise within this Fokker-Planck formulation is something we call a noise-induced transition. Okay, change in the stability and or fixed point as a result of a change in noise. Okay, so this is what we had. You know, same as on the previous slide, and so we can analyze this without the Fokker-Planck equation in a nutshell. Like this is just the analysis of the original stochastic differential equation. So in the absence of noise, we can define fixed points being like the non-trivial fixed point being square root of mu, square root of mean, and the bifurcation diagram for this system then kind of looks like so, and it gives us a pitchfork bifurcation, with the mu being the bifurcation parameter. So in other words, like as mu increases, the activity variable x in the domain of its fixed point is going to move from being having a single solution to splitting into these two, into being bistable and having two stable solutions for a given value of mu. Okay, so we've induced bistability by varying the bifurcation parameter mu. Okay, now so that's the kind of original equation, just the properties of that simple stochastic differential equation. So kind of take this to the Fokker-Planck concept now. Now we're kind of extending the idea of the state space, the state space of the variables, the dynamical variables, to the probability density on the state space, or on the dynamical variables. And I mean, if you kind of go through, then this is just giving the equivalent, like subbing in the expression in terms of Fokker-Planck for the stationary fixed point of the probability distribution. But the key thing that I want to point to here is actually just this image, right? So this is now like the Fokker-Planck equation perspective on the pitchfork bifurcation. The background here, or the color scaling, is the probability density, and the kind of density, or the darkness of the black is like the density amplitude. So if you think of the images we have back here, right? This was so high on these figures, right? like this high amplitude bit. This would be like the dark black bit in this kind of heat map here. Because here what we're doing is we're taking this and we're taking this for like a bunch of parameters, right? So we're kind of stretching this out on a I think mu. Are we varying mu? Excuse me. Yeah, we're varying mu. Yeah. So we're taking mu and we're varying mu, right? But basically the point is so this thing that was the y-axis here is now being the intensity of the black fuzz on this image here, and this is the kind of the probability distribution perspective on the pitchfork bifurcation that we're seeing in this stochastic differential equation. And then the point here, just to wrap up this little piece, is and the kind of important thing to make this point is another image that you're just gonna have to imagine. I'll just describe it to you. Is the location of the maximum of the heat map of the probability distribution, basically. So we can kind of define the maxima of the probability of the PDF of this cloud in this image here, an equation for the maxima, and then the location of the pitchfork bifurcation is like displaced slightly by the presence of noise. Okay, so the kind of, I guess, can't quite see it so clearly. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so apologies, this image doesn't quite nail it down, but the point is that, like, the mean of this cloud is not in exactly the same location as what we get if we just consider the original stochastic differential equation. So adding in putting this into the Fokker-Planck equation, where the multiplicative noise kind of interacts with the structure of the dynamics, shifts the location of the transition point into the bistable regime. So this is the type of thing that, again, was like described and defined as like noise-induced transitions. Okay, this anesthesia point I'm gonna come back to. And the next thing that I want to talk about is we'll come back to those slides in a bit. So just kind of continue the point that I was making just now with the pitchfork bifurcation. So that was an example of bistability, right? So bistability, this is just a brief point. So like bistability, we saw what that looked like over here was the emergence of this point here, where the dynamical variable can take one of two values, right? So from a dynamical point of view, or from like a kind of activity time series point of view, what you'd see is sitting on here and then moving over to here, and then or sitting at like high, low, period of high, period of low, period of high, period of low, right? That's kind of what bistable dynamics look like in a time series. But we also have bistability in our in some of our neural models as well. So in Wilson Cowan, which we've looked at several times, there's parameter configurations where we kind of see bistability. You know, in this case, like the bistability looks like it's kind of like folded on itself, okay, or if you like, we're kind of we have, if you take a slice, like a vertical slice, at any given point in this bifurcation diagram, then as you can see over here, like monostable, then we kind of reach a point where we have two 2 stable fixed points and 1 unstable fixed point, the saddle, okay? And then we have a saddle node bifurcation here, kind of moving over to a period of monostability. I think there's another, not sure if there's something else going on behind the legend here, but this is like the equivalent of that pitchfork bifurcation for one of the neural models that we've been looking at before. So we do have this kind of bistable phenomena modified by noise in Wilson-Cowan equations as well. And yeah, from the kind of neural dynamics point of view, it's allowing the system to visit different stable states. Okay, so those could be like, typically we think of those being high activity and low activity states. So the diagram is kind of indicating here. So the kind of well points here, so there and there. This would be like high activity state, low activity state, and you're kind of flip-flopping between this and this. So that's kind of a common type of dynamics that we do see in particularly neuron level recordings, to some extent also in EEG as well, but EEG is a little bit more continuous. But they look like this, where you've got like high activity, low activity, high activity, low activity, high activity, low activity, and one of the terms for this is like up states and down states, and the down states are something that is they come in a lot more clearly in certain types of brain states like sleep and also anesthesia. You have like more prevalence of these like long, low amplitude, low firing rate down states, and then movement between up states and down states, and then the movement between the up states and the down states like appears as a slow amplitude oscillation. But how to say, okay, get the terminology right here. It has some of the phenomenology of a low amplitude oscillation, but what it actually is a noisy bistable fluctuation. Okay. So we're going to keep going. Maybe this is the time to quickly address Shivank's question and take any other questions from the room. Shivank said, could neural noise actually play a functional role in how the brain processes information, like helping with creativity or adaptability? So Shivank, yes. I mean, that's one of the messages of what we're talking about here. I think I only gave one tangible example of that, which was the processing of like an image with an addition of some background noise, and that wasn't something that I'm emphasizing, but the general concept is exactly what you're saying. It's like the addition of noise or variability, right? Is one of the functions that it probably has is enabling certain types of dynamics, and that dynamics from the kind of dynamical systems perspective that we like to work with as computational neuroscientists lends itself quite well to some of the ideas that you're suggesting there, right? Like you say, creativity, adaptability. I think what we've got coming up is exploration, state space exploration, dynamical repertoire. These are kind of dynamical system lingo instantiations of, I think, the ideas that you're kind of going for there. So I think answer is yes. And that's one of the points that we're trying to get across here. Any other questions in the room? Nothing burning. We can move on to the break, and then as usual, we'll take a break, then we'll do our coding tutorial. So so there's a few, I mean, as I said at the start, like there's a number of things we can point to, talk about, define, elaborate, conceptualize as noise in terms of brain signals. One of them that we've also talked about to some extent is the power spectrum, and particularly the kind of 1/f structure of the power spectrum. But the from a human EEG point of view, so this is the activity that we see in the kind of high frequency part of the power spectrum is something that we know from various kinds of recordings is related to stuff that we don't see in non-invasive physiological recordings, but we can in some contexts, like recordings with patients, well, not so much recording patients for spikes, but like primate physiological studies, we know that the high frequency part of the spectrum is related to the spiking activity of neurons, and this is something that does change over age in this case over age, and also in terms of like pathological conditions as well. So this would be, if you like, if we interpret just this like broadband frequency component that we've got from say 75 to 150 hertz here, what you've got here in this study from Brad Wojtek and co is like a reduction in the amount of quote unquote high frequency neural noise. Sorry, an increase in the quote unquote high frequency neural noise. I say high frequency broadband 1/f. It's 1/f because it's covering quite a large frequency range, and it's like a line over a range of frequencies. Okay, so it's but that's also roughly what we mean by broadband as well. So this broadband high frequency noise is something that ramps up in older adults. This thing about the high frequency component of the power spectrum, we've also seen this in some previous lectures. So this is now a time frequency plot. So time frequency is on the x-axis, so 50 to 150 hertz here. The brightness is the power, the oscillatory power, the kind of amount of activity in this frequency range. So it's basically this over time, and then swapping in colors for the y-axis. So this is something that we also we have like variability in things like the high frequency response properties to things like presentation of visual images, which is what this example is showing us here. So that would be an example of your kind of trial level variability or inter-subject variability in the amplitude of a time series property, right? So that's like a time series property. It's a time series property because it's like part of the power spectrum over a large frequency range that we see variability in, and that's one of the things that is kind of conceptualized as noise, because it's not an oscillation, right? When it's spanning 100 hertz, it's a component of the power spectrum, but it's not something that's like properly thought of as an oscillation. So we often just kind of substitute in noise as being the concept to describe things that are spectral features that cover a large frequency range. So just kind of surveying some more concepts of noise here. One, as I mentioned in response to Shivank's question earlier, is noise, if you like, as a self-exploratory tool, or the term that is used by the guys in this study, and I think we've used already, is exploration of dynamic repertoire. Okay, so this is some work from a number of people. The senior author on this one was not Gus Deco, Breakspear, Jersa, think Victor Yursa seen you off on this, but some early whole brain modeling work, looking at basically a simple type of neural model. It's more or less a network of Fitz-Nagumo equations. I think it is literally a network of Fitz-Nagumo equations with time delays. And the dynamics of the units are kind of set up to show this type of phenomenology that we've talked about a few times here, where this is noisy fluctuations around some fixed point domain of the state space. Okay, it's a fixed point domain of the state space in the sense of that there's no noise, and we consider some transient perturbation away from the value of the fixed point. Then what we're seeing here over time is this damped oscillation, which in our state space, which is, I think, two-dimensional. Not sure why it's X, Y, Z here. I think the two-dimensional state space, it would look like a kind of spiral folding in on itself down to the middle, right? So that's our damped oscillation, but ultimately fixed point dynamics as the basic configuration of the neural units, but then add some noise, a little bit of Gaussian noise, Gaussian white noise, and we get, and by the way, the thick line through the middle is the mean. The mean of the two state variables, I think. And so the difference from this to this is that we're not flatlining, right? We're not going down, we're kind of being continually pushed off of zero or pushed off of our like nominal fixed point location by these little bumps from the noise, from this additive Gaussian noise input. And that's the kind of conceptualization of noise as contributing to state space exploration. This is kind of a diagram of it here. Yeah, this is the attractor. So this is a three-dimensional model. So this would be, did they use the Hindmarsh-Rose? Yeah, okay. I'm blanking on exactly which model this is, but it's something that's pretty similar to Fitz-Nagumo, but is three-dimensional. So excuse me for not remembering exactly what the model is, but the dynamics are basically the same. So we've got this spiral now. Unless that is time. No, not time. So spiral. Do you see the little kind of yellow line here? Moving around down to the middle point around here. So this is like the fixed point location, and this manifold in the background, this is the kind of manifold of the state space over which the dynamics unfold. And then add the noise in. So the kind of point that's being made from here to here, that's maybe a little bit more in indicating this idea of like exploring the state space or exploring the repertoire of the system, is the orange kind of mush here, right? So there's the system is kind of sampling its configuration possibilities more. I mean, that's one way of thinking about what's going on here. It's kind of sampling in a ultimately more complete way the locations in its state space, which is the kind of locations on this like convex hull, and that's what's being enabled by the addition of the noise. So that's what kind of looks like in the state space. So the state space representation, even just this three-dimensional state space representation, gives you a little bit of the flavor of the idea of like exploration of a repertoire, or like exploration of the configuration possibilities, a little bit more than just looking at the time series, because the time series aren't giving you the space as such. They're giving you kind of axes of the locations of the individual axes of the space, like overlaid on each other. So that's like the concept that what these guys, Gosh and co, and then a number of other people have worked with as a way of thinking about resting state brain activity. They'd done this for like large scale resting state brain network dynamics. And that was what we were talking about a few lectures back. So just to kind of continue that point and do a little bit of a callback to some of the things that we were moving through at a kind of fast clip a few lectures back. But as I said, the things that we're talking about now in this lecture, focusing on the noise, we've talked about them before. So this is one of the ones that we've talked about before, right? If you recall, I had this 5 kind of concepts of resting state brain dynamics. And I mainly focused on these like 2 to 5, and particularly like 2 to 4, 2, 3, 4 are kind of versions of the same thing, right? So so this is from like literally a quote from, excuse me, I think the concept was introduced by these guys, which is why we're kind of reviewing this here. But also Deco and co was this 2014 study that we looked at in a little bit more detail, but both of them are pointing to the same general idea. And I guess the later work is building on, to some extent, an idea laid down in that 2008 paper from the previous slide. So resting state brain dynamics reflect noise-driven exploration of the brain's dynamic repertoire. And then, you know, again, like we've gone over these things now. So noisy perturbations around a single or multi-stable fixed point. This is not multi-stable. This is a single stable fixed point, but this is just one node of a network. If we think about either different configurations, which and different models, we might have multi-stability rather than this kind of single fixed point. But in both cases, this is what the noisy perturbations are, right? The noise is giving us these noisy perturbations around this stable, multi-stable fixed point dynamics, and also close to bifurcation being where the action is from the point of view of things like getting a little bit of quasi-periodic or damped oscillatory activity with some amount of small noise injection that, you know, has a response and isn't like fully damped by it being extremely stable, which it tends to be far away from the bifurcations. So yeah, that we talked about this being in the kind of general sense like a filter and even a linear filter that we can conceptualize as diffusion on a graph. So those two, I don't necessarily want to revisit the linear eigenmodes part, but just to finish the kind of callback to the things we were thinking about from the whole brain modeling point of view, because this is an example of the use of the concept of noise in a kind of constructive way of like how it contributes to some of the activity that we see and maybe is a kind of important ingredient of activity that we see very easily. I mean, like it's at this point like quite easy to like measure fMRI activity in living humans. Like we're quite good at this at this point. We're not very good at understanding what it means, because we don't really know yet. But these are things that we can do, like measure these correlation matrices of how much signals are correlated between different brain areas. And the point, yeah, just kind of reviewing where we were, was that in this like one-dimensional bifurcation diagram, where we were looking at some kind of aggregate quantity, which is like the fit with the experimental data. But if you recall, there was other bifurcation diagrams that were kind of at the individual node level. We had this property where the fit to the experimental data, or the description of the kind of structure of this correlation matrix, was maximal at a certain value of the coupling strength. that that maximize the fit to the experimental data. Okay, so this is an example of a like a kind of noise-driven dynamical process. So that was something that we thought about in that case also with the Fokker-Planck formalism, but we looked at something different. Okay, so our original dynamical model that we fed into Fokker-Planck that time was this, which is the dynamic mean field model from Deco 2013. Okay, that's what the paper that I'm reviewing here. I should have the reference down here. Apologies for missing that. But this was a kind of simple dynamical model, dynamic neural model. I mean, it's linear and one-dimensional. Sorry, it's not linear because of what's inside this, but it is one-dimensional. So this was the dynamics of the NMDA receptor fluctuations, the synaptic gating variable for the slow glutamatergic neural population within a whole brain network. The whole brain network came from here. We have this connectivity matrix C and our indices I. So there were like 100 brain regions, so 100 by 100 connection weights between brain regions, and then the input to each brain region was being kind of summed in, so like row summed by this term here, and then fed into basically the activation function here, and then coming into our dynamical variable here, plus noise, by the way. Okay, so this is the dynamical model, and if you recall, this was derived from a leak integrating fire spiking network model, and then substituted into Fokker-Planck. Okay, so the addition into the Fokker-Planck was a little bit more involved because we had to break this into two components, like A and a B component. So more involved than the example we looked at a few slides back. But the point that I just want to make, without repeating everything about what we looked at for this in the previous lecture, was that the thing that we were looking at with the Fokker-Planck analysis last time was not the location of the analog of the fixed points, i.e. the modes, the peaks of the probability density function. So not the value of, sorry for going back and forth here, of, I want to say capital P, or capital rho here. No, that's of capital. Do I have the first one here? Oh, bear with me a second. Yes, this one, this, and this. Right. Okay. Yeah. So so what we looked at a few slides back was we substituted a kind of minimal stochastic differential equation into Fokker-Planck, and then looked at the probability distribution of the states, and the kind of telling us about the well, we didn't actually think about time series so much, but we thought about the kind of probability of states being here or here, and what was the modes of that and the shape of that probability distribution. So in other words, like in this case, it'd be like that. This guy. What we also had with Fokker-Planck is this guy, which is the variance. So we have a time evolution of the mean and a time evolution of the variance of the distribution. And when we were looking at this in the lecture last time, we were actually focusing, unlike a few slides back, we were focusing on the second of those, on the time evolution of the covariance, because the covariance is, in kind of neuroimaging terms and so in neuroscience terms, the functional connectivity, i.e. this state. right? So the reason why we went to the Fokker-Planck equation, or rather why Deco and co went to the Fokker-Planck equation to expand on what is learned about the properties of this model of functional connectivity and large-scale brain networks using a mean field model. The rationale for doing that was to be able to go and do some analysis of the covariance part of the Fokker-Planck equation, and then again just moving quickly through what we looked at last time in the lecture a few sessions back, is that could then be broken down into a time evolution of this the probability distribution, but driven by a big fat Jacobian matrix that kind of encodes the dynamics around, like, linearized around a fixed point. So all of the dynamics were kind of rewritten into this giant matrix J, but the point being that we could then do some algebra when we kind of set this to 0 to give us a expression for the covariance matrix in terms of the eigenvectors of the anatomy. Okay, so that was the rationale for what we were doing with the Fokker-Planck equation last time. Again, different focus than looking for the modes and the shape of the distribution with respect to the mean, focusing rather on the covariance, but still in the general space of the theme of today's lecture, right, which is like the concept of noise and the use of noise in neural systems and in our models of them. So that's my callback to the stuff we were looking at last time. So we're getting towards the end of the lecture now. I think I've got a few more slides to go, so hang in there. Right, so recall we have firing rate distributions, firing rate functions, response functions, activation functions. These turn up everywhere in computational neuroscience. They mean slightly different things in slightly different contexts. In the case of a neuron, it's like, when does the neuron fire? How fast does a neuron fire as a function of its input current, right? We call those FI curves. Frequency current, sorry. Yeah, firing rate frequency as in F, current, injected current as in I, FI curves. In the case of neural population models, this wasn't like the firing rate of a neuron, but it was like the population firing rate of a neural population, or just the activation level of a kind of abstract artificial neural network element. And those often look like sigmoids. So this is getting to the next point that I want to make. So we talked about, when we highlighted the benefits of noise, like bullet point list, like what's noise doing potentially in the brain, insofar as we can understand it with our theoretical neuroscience lens. One of them was noise-induced linearization. Okay, so look about that relatively briefly. So it's a similar, yeah, it's kind of similar to the convergence to the Gaussian distribution that I talked about earlier in terms of the like sum of Poisson processes. So I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's the same type of thing. So if we have some neural system, don't even need to get into the details of exactly what equations. We have some neural system that has some response function that's nonlinear, and we add additive dynamics, then it linearizes things, and a bit of Jeremie there in the commentary as well. So like that's exciting. I mean, it is, again, like there's at least two reasons why we care about these things. One is because it's interesting, maybe sort of understanding how the brain works. It's also very helpful from a theory point of view when we can basically drop nonlinear things. But just to kind of go there. So the idea is, if you have some part of your equation, it doesn't really matter where, right? But in this case, the part of the equation where we see like nonlinearities, as I've said previously, often it's called the nonlinearity, is the activation function, or the sigmoid response, the FI curve, etc. So that's something that will be kind of low, and then have some low or kind of zero quiescent, and then as a function of some input, then there's some domain. Could be a narrow domain, but some domain where it's linear, and then it saturates. Okay, but so this is, if you think about a kind of spectrum of nonlinearity, where a Heaviside function, where it's just like 0, 1, nothing in between, being like one end of that spectrum, and then the other end of the spectrum being just a diagonal line from low to high, then the addition of random noise moves us along that spectrum. So we saw that already to some extent in the idea in the Wilson-Cowan equation around the use of the sigmoid in the first place. So if you recall, the idea that was articulated, I don't think in the 1972 paper, but at some point shortly after, by Wilson and Cowan, I guess maybe post hoc rationalization, I'm not sure, but a reason why it makes sense to use sigmoids when you're talking about something that is not intrinsically sigmoidal in the context of the like setup of the Wilson-Cowan equations. So the setup of Wilson-Cowan equations was like offs and ons, right? A very simple, basic starting point framing of neural model. So it's like, we've got a bunch of neurons in a population. Sometimes they're off, as in they're not firing. Sometimes they're on, as in they're firing. And then what they do is from now until the next time step in the future, they either like start firing. If they're not firing, they continue not firing. If they're not firing, they continue firing if they're firing, or they stop firing if they're firing, right? So that's like the transition probability matrix. And the question is just like, what are the dynamics of that transition probability matrix when there's both excitation and inhibition? But the basic components of that were firing, not firing, right? So on and off. So that's a very nonlinear transition from, or a very, very nonlinear activation function, because the states that the neurons can take is just binary, like 0 and 1. So it'd be like a kind of just a sharp line here. So the reason why ultimately the sigmoid is used as the activation function, or the rationale given for using the sigmoid and activation function, is that because it's a neural population level description, so it's not talking about individual neurons, talking about like a statistically large enough number of neurons that for which there is some variability in what their threshold is. And the threshold in that case, it would be, as I was saying, the Heaviside function was like firing threshold, and so as a function of input, and then so off, and then at some point it'd be like, okay, you've crossed your threshold, then you're on, and it'd be a vertical line, right? As in a Heaviside function. So the idea, the rationale for using sigmoids, when you have basically a population or average over a population of unit of Heaviside functions, is like that's actually what you get when you take when you average you take the average of a large number of Heaviside functions, you get a sigmoid. You take the average as in you take a Gaussian distribution, or Gaussian distribution weighted sum of Heaviside functions gives you a sigmoid function. So that's like a similar idea of what we're making here in a slightly different context is the addition of noise. So in that case, addition of noise is like variability over the neurons in the population in what their threshold to transition from not firing to firing is. So what the location on the x-axis of the jump in the vertical part of the Heaviside function is. But you know, insofar as that is like of that argument is taking something that's sharp and then blurring it with some noise, in that case, like noise being, we just assume that there's lots of these things that they're slightly different. That's kind of what injecting noise is doing as well, right? Injecting noise being like giving you a bunch of instantiations of something that's varying from some average. So there's kind of two ways of getting it, of a kind of linearization type process. But yeah, the argument making here is actually more about this idea of like increasing linearization. So if you just simply take a sigmoid and you add a bunch of random noise, then take sigmoid, add a bunch of random noise, average them, then they'll move towards something that's kind of got a larger linear regime, right? And then the endpoint being kind of fully linear, just straight line from low to high. So that's a kind of one type of noise-induced linearization that's quite a simple one to get your head around. Yeah, and it's related to something called dithering in engineering. So there's this kind of stabilizing effect of a little bit of random perturbation. And there's other things. So there's other things that are like related types of noise-induced stabilization and linearization. So if we take a network now, so network of Poisson neurons, like summing over the network, some distribution of some connectivity matrix with our W here, that'd be like all the lines in this little sketch. So yeah, W's here, activity in the U's. So we're talking about the rate of change of activity in our network. And then again, without showing the derivation, the kind of mean field of this network is given by this equation. So we're going to have a scalar equation for the average activity of this network, okay? And the fixed points of this of the mean field expression for the network are modified by the noise level. So the way to think about that, again, well, the kind of sketch similar to the sketch I was showing here, think about kind of a variation from more nonlinear to more linear. And then varying the noise amplitude, so the standard deviation of the noise over here. So this kind of moves us. So this kind of bifurcation diagram, yeah, bifurcation diagram here is showing us what do we put in here? Is this the real part of the eigenvalues? I think it is. So the real part of the eigenvalues of the Jacobian of this guy as a function of increasing noise is moving closer to 0. So I forget what RC is here, but we're actually kind of modifying the like level of stability of the dynamics. Stability being the point where the real part of the eigenvalues is 0. as a function of the amount of noise. And the use of the two lines here, so the yellow, the blue line for the mean field and the white line for the network, is more or less just to show that they show the same basic pattern and the same basic location. So the mean field description is actually giving a correct description of what you would get if you did a more complicated analysis at the numerically more complicated analysis of the same thing for the entire network. So the real parts, the kind of change of the real parts of the eigenvalues as a function of the noise modifies, and two examples, two kind of locations on this axis here are being shown here for the first few eigenvalues plotted in the complex plane. So we're comparing here the yellow dots and the gray dots. And the overall thing is to just say, you see we have this kind of distribution, this like little, I mean, Gaussian shaped thing, but I don't think it matters. It's not a Gaussian thing, but it's kind of moving, you know, I'll follow the cursor here. Okay, so it's shifting. So the grays are shifting to the yellows as a function of the noise. So increasing the noise shifts the entire distribution of the real part of the eigenvalues to the left. And the result of that is that some of them are then going to kind of become stable. Because if they're above zero, then they're unstable. In the gray case, you can see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 unstable eigenvalues in the ones that are plotted. There's more that aren't plotted. Like unstable, and they're not changing in terms of their location on the y-axis, as you can see. But they do have a non-zero imaginary part, so there's oscillations here. But the key thing is that, you know, if we compare the grays and the gray distribution and the yellow distribution, then we've got a bunch more stable eigenvalues when we have more noise. So the title line here, right, like increasing the stability by adding noise, is like we increase the noise level, we shift the eigenvalues over to the left on the real part of the eigenvalues over to the left, and that makes more of them stable than in the case when there's less noise. A different type of dynamical effect, stabilizing effect, but a qualitative, you know, dynamical effect that noise is having on the properties of the system. Another thing that we can get here that we didn't see, in fact, I don't think this is being shown here, right? So this was, get this right, these are all moving over, yeah. So none of these are shifting up and down, but they are shifting to the left. But we're making a different point here, is we can also get a shift in the oscillatory frequency. Okay, so this is again for different values of the noise, right? High and low value of the noise. So just plotting the average, this is the mean field term, so the network average from the network mean, but as given by the mean field equation for the network over here. And this is the equivalent simulated spiking network as a raster plot here, just to kind of show you, like, this is a simplified description of this for two different values of noise. So we've got more, you can see the kind of expected thing where, like, more noise, the yellow, we're getting these like larger fluctuations. That's not surprising. But what's also happened here that you can just about see in the time series, but you can really see in the power spectrum, is the frequency's changed. It's gone up slightly, right? So again, the gray is this low noise case, the yellow is this high noise case. So you've moved from there being a dominant oscillation in the network at 10 hertz, and then it's harmonic appearing at 20 hertz there, to the dominant oscillation in the network being 15 hertz, and also a lot stronger. Which now let me kind of just, is that consistent with the change in the stability? Not sure off the top of my head. in any case, change in the frequency, still got a harmonic over there, but change in the frequency, okay? So that's a different type of effect on the dynamics than the change in the stability is the frequency. That would relate to the complex part of the imaginary part of the eigenvalues. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that we look at when we're doing computational neuroscience and measuring oscillatory brain activity. So that's quite a kind of profound type of effect that noise can, in theory, have. I mean, this is a modeling study that I wouldn't say this is like kind of fully established experimental phenomenon, but this is something that we know from the computational neuroscience perspective at a kind of, you know, sufficiently deep and complete mathematical level that noise can have this type of, you know, important dynamical effect on the properties of like oscillatory networks. So this is like the same thing, just plotted continuously over the noise there, kind of shift from this frequency here. So the shift is actually quite quick if you think about the noise level. So and again, it's plotting the the network, so the kind of numerical simulation versus the mean field, numerical simulation of the mean field, but still the kind of simpler model there, basically showing the same behavior. So the mean field model is doing quite well, but that kicked in quite early, at least over this range of noise values of D, right? Kind of moved up to roughly where it stayed in terms of the frequency, didn't change too much. Okay, and final point to wrap up the lecture now is continuing so kind of application of that example that we just showed. So this is an observation that's a pretty interesting thing from physiological recordings in anesthesia. So this is data from Patrick Purdon from a little while back. So it's looking at, under application of anesthesia, what the spectral signature of the EEG is in relation to this point that's the loss of consciousness and the regaining of consciousness, LOS, ROC. Sorry, loss of, that's a typo, LOC. Yeah, sorry, LOC and ROC. So this is the point where you know, fall asleep. Well, you lose consciousness when you're, you know, in surgery, going under anesthesia for whatever reason. So the data, the thing that's being shown here is the distribution of frequencies measured in the EEG. And I mean, and over a period of like 30 minutes. So, and these topo plots, what we call them, these kind of circles here, these are just slices. So let's see. So I mean, so this is like, these are kind of get this the right way around, the frequency here. This is the amplitude of this. So this is an average of this at here. You're doing an average of this. This is the frequency. Yeah, okay. So each of the circles on the bottom, these are like EEG on the head. It will be kind of 30 or 60 channels, something like that. At each of those points on the head, there's a amplitude of a specific frequency, okay? And yeah, is that the amplitude of, I think it's going to be the alpha frequency that's plotted. Yep, okay. So this would be the amplitude at 10 hertz. But there's also power at different frequency bands as well. So this is showing you the amplitude at 10 hertz at different locations in the head for a few like single time slices, for which this one, the the loss of consciousness one is like this time slice of 0. The regaining consciousness one is this time slice 0. And this is, actually, I think this is going to be the average of a window over here, probably. And this is somewhere close to the end of the experiment. So but the key thing here is actually the upper plot. So the upper plot is saying I'm looking at now, not looking over space, but looking over frequencies, but using the data from the EEG and saying what is the amplitude, the spectrogram at different frequencies at different points in time, moving up to this LOC point and after it, and then I guess there's a few hours of surgery, and then moving up to and then after it again. So the phenomenon here is called the smile effect, right? And it's a smile because it's like a smile, right? But what is it? It's a modification in the both the amplitude, but also the frequency, the dominant frequency of oscillation as a function of basically increasing and decreasing levels of anesthesia. So the anesthesia, if you think about the anesthesia being applied sometime early, before the loss of consciousness, right? So you've had some initiation of the application of the anesthetic, and then you've got the power at different frequencies, and then over time, the dominant frequency shifts down, and particularly in the period after, say, like the high anesthetic state when they're unconscious, it's dominating around here. And then in the kind of reverse direction, when they're coming out, we basically get the replication of the same thing, but mirrored. So this is an experimental, example of the type of thing that we were looking at in the model in the previous slide, which is a modification of the frequency structure of an oscillatory brain network. So this work from Axel Hout was trying to do exactly this, basically use the noise-driven, stochastic mean field model, brain network model that I showed you a few slides back, to try and capture this smile effect, but model it as a function that's induced by the amount of noise. So without going into the details here, the basic point, because I think you've seen enough of it, is that the idea is that there's a decrease in the amount of noise. So the amplitude of the D, so they're kind of scaling down the amplitude of the noise over time, scaling it back up, and scaling down the amplitude of the noise modifies the network frequency in the way that we saw in the model previously. But to some extent, you kind of know you can do this, right? So if you can kind of change the frequency parametrically-ish by modifying the noise, then that you can get that smile effect change pretty much. So it was kind of, I guess, quite a smart kind of putting two things together quite intuitively. But yeah, this is so what we could get out of that is a proposal for thinking about what the network level mechanism of the modification in the frequency distribution as a function of the anesthesia is, as being a property of the amount of noise in the system. And it's reasonably intuitive, or it fits with the fact that if you think about what at the level of neural activity is in the kind of firing rates of neurons happens when you apply anesthetic, and particularly you apply surgical levels of anesthesia, they go down, right? Neurons fire less when they're anesthetized, surprise, surprise. And if we then go back in a nice kind of rounding way to one of the first few points I made, the concept of the noise term, the additive noise term in the the kind of firing rate level mean field models and neural models is it's like the background activity level, right? That's like the way to conceptualize what that noise term means from the kind of embedded neural network point of view. And when you apply the anesthesia and the neurons are firing less, then the amplitude of that background activity is lower, right? So that's why that kind of links with what we also know about the impact of anesthesia at a kind of neural firing rate level. So I guess you think about this like one kind of theory or a concept of one of the phenomenon that's observed in anesthesia. There's a whole lot. Anesthesia is like a fascinating topic that I don't understand very well, but there's a lot of interesting phenomena like this that are, I think, still pretty live territory for theoretical neuroscientists. And I think noise is probably a big part of noise in the sense of, you know, background activity level effectively is probably one of the big parts of how that kind of has a substantial effect on neural dynamics and probably ultimately on, you know, conscious level and cognition. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. A bunch of summary points. I don't think I'll go through them, but these were the points that we went through. Again, like we've covered a lot of this already, so we laid a lot of the ground before. So we've just kind of gone a little bit deeper on what the noise is doing, and what it can do in some of the systems that we've been looking at. And there's a lot more to say about noise than I've been able to cover in this lecture, but I'm giving you a few pointers. Okay, so a few questions, then we'll take a break. Anything on the Slack? Anything in the room? Yep. Mm-hmm. You mean in the frequency change part? You mean this one or the one with the response function? This one, yeah. Well, yeah. I don't think so. The example here, I didn't actually go into kind of a lot of detail. So there's some work like in the visual system, looking at these kind of contrast invariants, like orientation tuning, that are actually studying the way in which noise influences the shape of the response function at a kind of granular level. So I'm kind of pointing to, I can kind of point you to some of this work to kind of see how that plays out in terms of like experimental manipulation of noise level in there's two ways you can kind of experimentally manipulate noise, two kind of broad ways, right? One is in the image and another is in the brain. Now, I think in general in these kind of visual system experiments, they're kind of doing that in the images. We showed an example of that in the, you know, right at the start, we're showing those kind of variably degraded images. So I'm not sure I can't think of a clear example of how you can like really control the noise level of a response function of in an experimental context, but I think that's an interesting question. But yeah, I'm just kind of like trying to elaborate here because the point I was making here was quite a general point. I wasn't giving any experimental results to it. I wasn't putting it in the context of a specific model. So I'm not trying to make a very strong point here other than to say like you can modify the shape of a sigmoid by adding noise. But yes, the answer to your question is absolutely. Like I think it will change the like dynamical and the information coding properties of the system, and then that could be detrimental, could be well, so you're saying would it would reduce
one just sort of like one thing, like what sort of like experimentally what sort of implications does this noise have?
Yeah.
Like the overall network capacity.
Yeah, right. I think there's like many answers to that question in a nutshell, because I think like depending on how you set it up, even just this case of like what is the shape of the response function, that I don't think it's not the case that it being linear means that it has less information properties per se, because the more linear it is, the more you have a kind of the more sensitivity you have over a wider range. So it kind of depends basically like, what it is that you're defining as like a good thing, kind of in terms of like a responsivity. Like if you have, so arguably, like if you have a wider domain of over which you'll like respond to inputs, then you have a broader capacity to respond to inputs, right? But it depends on what you're trying to say. Like if you want to say precision, then maybe the opposite is true, right? So I don't think there's like a single answer to the question of like what does adding noise to a sigmoid do for its coding properties per se, and it depends on how that kind of feeds into something that you're evaluating. But the things we've been talking about here have been really kind of dynamic things, right? They've been more about like how that changes the stability or the frequency response and so on. Haven't really been doing what we did a few lectures back and thinking about like classification and like number of states and dimensionality of attractor space and so on. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know really. I can't give you a clear answer like what linearization of sigmoid would do to the dimensionality of a state space, but in like a hot field network, for example. Interesting question. But I think, yeah, like the question of, I think the general answer to your question, like what is the effect of adding some linearization, adding some noise at any point, right? Whether it's like on the sigmoid, whether it's like on the inputs to the neurons, which is what the additive term is doing in most of the context that we've seen it. It kind of depends what it is that we're talking about, whether that's like better or worse. And there isn't like a single answer to the question. So hopefully that's satisfactory. Might not be. Good question though. So I've got a question from Krish. Okay, for the presentation, question about the presentation. So Krish, I'll take your question but I'll talk about that when I'm going through the tutorial, which we'll get to shortly. So get back to you there. Yeah, thanks. So we're coming up to close, guys. If there's no other burning questions, we'll kind of call it a day for the intro lecture, take a quick break, and then come back and move quite quickly through our tutorial for today. So it's 4:27. Let's see you back here, 4:35. Okay. Yeah, so once again, Paz has done a stellar job of putting together a notebook that covers a lot of the stuff in the that we covered today in the lecture. Often he does a better job than me, and that's no complaints there. So what he's got, it's about 13 minutes, this video, so that's about the right time for how long we've got. But obviously you can go through this in your own time, but it's going to go through these 4 kind of key mechanisms that we indicated as like things that noise does. Okay, stochastic resonance, generating oscillations, noise-induced transitions, and linearization. One thing that I'll just comment, because I've noticed this, is when you're running the notebook, if you're the first time you're doing it and you get down to here and you get an error where it says matplot widget, so it's like doing this widget magic. The thing you need to do is you need to go to runtime and you need to do restart session, because this is just a Google Colab thing. It's like it's not fully completed installing the libraries or the library that's needed for that. So if you get an error there, when you do matplot widget, just do restart session, specifically restart session, not anything else than that, and then run everything from the start, and you'll find that this cell should execute. So without further ado, let me kick off his recording. Are you seeing the Chrome window okay on the call? And then the next question will be, are you hearing things okay? And then I'll have to deal with us hearing it here in the room as well. Shut the volume.
Hi everyone, welcome to tutorial 8, noise in the brain. Hi everyone, welcome to tutorial 8, noise in the brain. As the title suggests, this tutorial is going to be all about noise and the influence that the noise can have in neural computation. So when we think about noise, generally our mind goes to detrimental effects so that noise reduces our signal ratio, and generally adds a lot of uncertainty and variability to our signal. But here we're going to review several cases through which noise can actually have a enhancing effect in terms of the computation that's going on. We have 4 different examples here: stochastic resonance, generation of oscillations, noise-induced transitions, and linearization of responses. And in each of these cases, noise can be implemented in a unique ways to actually get us effects that you would otherwise not have. So let's get started with the first section, which is, let me just run this code right here. Here it's the first example is stochastic resonance. So essentially this is cases where we have a signal, an oscillation of signal, but the oscillation doesn't really reach the threshold for detection of that signal. So even though we have some sort of background underlying activity, underlying dynamic going on, we wouldn't be able to detect it because the activity never reaches the threshold to be able for us to be able to detect them. So here, well, if we can see if we add noise to it, then generally there are cases where this noise will push this dynamic over the edge and actually result, for example, in a neural example, a neuron example, a firing rate, which we can detect. And we can see that in this case, what the effect that noise actually has is allowing us to detect the signal that's going would otherwise go undetected. And as we increase, we can see that, you know, the peaks are aligning, the detection peaks are aligning with the top phase of the signal that we have. And then, so now the question that arises here is that, well, to what extent this is actually beneficial? If we have zero noise, then we don't get any signal. But we also, if we have too much noise, then we see that our detected signal resembles nothing like the underlying dynamics, supposedly underlying dynamics that was ongoing. So if we plot the performance as a function of the noise, the magnitude of the noise, we can see that there's a sweet spot. There's and you had this a similar figure in your lecture as well. There's a sort of a sweet spot where the correlation with the true phase, this correlation with the underlying signal, the latent signal, is maximal, below which it's too weak for us to be able to detect any signals, or the signals are very sparse, and above which the noise becomes too dominant. So the signal actually gets wiped out or muddied out. So this is one example of noise. Uh, another example of noise uh, having a computational effect is in, for example, inducing oscillations. So in this example, we are working with the Lively-Wright neural mass model, and you've been exposed to similar neural mass models before. It's a system of a couple of differential equations. So there's a population, there's an excitatory and inhibitory population. The specifics differ, but for example, we've gone through the Wilson-Cowan equations a couple of times throughout the course of this uh, lecture, or throughout this course. So here, what's happening here is that this system gives us a stable it doesn't give us a sustained oscillation, doesn't give us a limit cycle. What it does give us is a stable node, or stable spiral rather, a sort of uh, oscillation that gradually decays to zero. So if the crucial part of this system is that we actually inject external noise to the system to simulate neural dynamics. Let me show you how it looks like. So this would be a phase portrait of our dynamic throughout this phase plane, and this would be the time series of our signal. So what happens is that when the system is initialized with noise, it sort of kind of oscillates around the center point, and it gives us that sort of oscillations that is typical in neural systems. However, when we actually have, well, oh, whoops. So the phase portrait is not being rendered properly, but what you would have seen is that with varying different when we have a zero noise, with if we reduce the noise, we will just see our dynamic start from an initial condition and then fall over into a stable point and just remain there. And so we wouldn't see any sort of oscillations at all. It would be a flat line. But as we increase the amount of noise in our oscillations, then we actually do get if we increase the amount of injected noise in our system, we typically, as the system tends to go towards that stable point, the noise pushes it farther back again, and so it keeps falling and keeps being pushed back. So that artificial injection of noise allows us to actually replicate neural oscillations. So this is another example where noise can actually have beneficial computational effects. Another example here is noise-induced transitions. This is within systems that have bistability. So we have two different stable points or stable regimes within our phase portrait, and typically without noise, what happens is that our when we initialize a point in our system, it falls into one of the two stable points and it remains there. However, when we have noise, it allows us to actually bounce between those two different regimes and actually enrich the dynamics that our system can exhibit. So here we're going to be demonstrating that interaction through just a pitchfork a system that is undergoing a pitchfork bifurcation, and we'll see how the injection of noise, increasing noise levels, will affect first the bifurcation of the system, when and how the system bifurcates, and second, the transitions between the two different stable regimes of that system. So here, yeah, what we're seeing here is essentially this is the potential function of our system. So what it's saying is that it wants to go into deepest valley, the lowest point, and it just stays there. So if we initialize the system over here, it's just gonna fall over and just stay here. And it's gonna, this is a well, this is gonna have a local minimum that it's got stuck on. Or if we just initialize over here, it's gonna fall into another point. So if we just randomly initialize different conditions, we'll see a bimodal distribution where the points will gather around the two stable fixed points. And so over here, what we're seeing is the bifurcation diagram of our system. So as we increase the bifurcation parameter, we're seeing that this a single point pitchforks into two different fixed points. So this would be, it can, so this, for example, this slide that you're seeing right here, you can think of it as looking at this from above. This each cross section would be one sort of one representation like this figure like here. So as we increase the bifurcation parameter, we can see that our system bifurcates from one fixed point to two fixed points. But the effect of noise, represented here as D, makes it so that both the boundaries between two different conditions, as well as the bifurcation point itself, gets fuzzied out, gets blurred out a bit. So you would have more unstable and more easily transitionable states within our dynamic. So, for example, if we simulate, in the case of that we have actually injected noise into our system, if we simulate the time series for it, we can see that our dynamic starts from one point, falls into a stable point, but then this noise will occasionally kick it to the other stable point, and then it keeps within the other stable point, and it might also bounce back to the other point and keeps going back and forth. So what this actually, the effect that this has, that it actually allows us to allows this system to exhibit richer dynamics and actually transition between different modes because of this effect that the noise has, just kicking it out of one stable well into the other. And lastly, another effect that noise can have is to linearize non-linear responses or non-linear functions. So for example, let's just take the example of a sigmoid function. A sigmoid function typically it looks like this. It's flat on the edges and steep in the middle. And we've come across sigmoid functions throughout this course as well. For example, in the case of estimating firing rates from voltage, membrane potential. So what this is showing here is that if you have no noise, then our dynamic falls perfectly on the sigmoid. But as we increase the noise level, and if you have multiple different samples that we're averaging over, what happens is that the response function, it actually starts to approximate more a linear function rather than a sigmoidal function. So why would this be beneficial? Well, other than just, making it more computationally efficient to simulate it, it would also be beneficial in terms of for computation itself, because it expands the dynamic range of our function. It becomes sensitive to expanded regions of input rather than just a specific bound. Now, this might be good or might be bad, but depending on the application that is being used. But essentially, it would allow one effect of it would be that it would allow our system to exhibit a broader range of dynamics, a broader dynamic range. And yeah, so those were a couple of examples in which noise can actually have a enhancing computational effects on within neural systems. Thank you.
Round of applause for Pazana. I think still on his meditation retreat. Hopefully feeling very at peace after a week of that. Yeah, great job. So that's a resource for you guys. The link for that I will add to the Moodle right now, and the link for the slide materials is already there. So that's everything for today. So Krish had a question that I'll answer and then kind of wrap up on the on just the general kind of comms.
Excuse
Just
me,
trying
can
to
I
get-
ask a question about the code, the notebook before you move on from that?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead, Shirin.
Yeah, I just opened it and I see some other errors. I don't want to take too much time to go through them or ask you about them, but if there are errors, what should we do? Like,
Do you want to do a quick screen share, Shirin, and I'll see if there's an obvious answer while I'm trying to find
so
Krish's
basically, you remember when Parsa was talking about those pictures that hadn't rendered on the right side? So
Yeah.
it's just before part 4. And so I just went there to play it again, to run it again and see if it renders, and then I get this error. You want me to screen share or you want to just...
I think, Sharon, what we can do, this will be a good opportunity that we haven't done too much of yet, is make use of the forum thing. So
Okay.
if you could summarize any issue you're having, like on, I think there's a discussion thread for the thing that has for the post that has the links in it, but there should be somewhere, at least somewhere around there's like a discussion thread. So maybe I think that'll be the best place for us to address kind of technical questions from this and anything else as well, by the way. So if you can summarize the issue there, then I'll try and read that and get you the answer as soon as possible. If it's possible to do like screenshots of errors, that's the easiest way to give quick and effective answers to code questions, in my experience.
That's a
So
great
I'm just
idea.
trying to...
Thank you.
Good. I'm just trying to get to Krish's question. I'm trying to find my mouse so I can get there. Where in the world is the mouse? Oh. So Krish had a question about the assignments or something. So it said, for the presentation, we need to pick a topic from a tutorial and explain in front of you, right? Yeah, Krish, yes, so that's correct. So for the presentations in 2 weeks, we'll want you to take one of the notebooks. So one of the parts of the notebooks that you've done for the assignments and expand on it. So play around, explore some ideas, have fun, do some interesting stuff. And then the presentation should be you basically pulling up the browser, loading up the notebook, having some images, right, ready to roll. You don't need to execute them, right? Just have them there in the notebook, and have some kind of summary text. But like do the presentation in a notebook rather than spending time making a separate PowerPoint or something. That is a perfectly good way of presenting stuff to a group in the, like, you know, browser-based co-op notebook context. But, you know, get that kind of in a good kind of shape, like Paz has been doing mostly, so that he can just kind of roll through it and then just tell us what you've done in a fairly relaxed format. That's the idea. If that's not clear, feel free to ask again, ping me if you need a little bit more clarification. But we're not overdoing it on the prep for the presentations is the idea. Kind of focus on just what you want to say rather than, you know, working too much on making a kind of separate set of materials to do it with. Okay, so that's it for today. Have a good week, guys. Any questions, ideas, thoughts, ruminations about life, do share them with me and the group via the Moodle or via email. Happy to hear from you, and see you next time.